This video is kindly sponsored by Ground News.
Even atheists today are admitting that the universe, space-time and matter, had a beginning out of nothing.
Space-time and matter had a beginning out of nothing.
Part of the value of the ontological argument is to invite people to consider a more enchanting metaphysic.
Many of them were saying we need a new theory of evolution.
The language of a legal transaction is being utilized.
It just passes the buck to the next thing.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. It is true. You can show it to be fact.
Did the conquest of Canaan actually happen?
The evidence overwhelmingly supports historical conquest.
Does it now? I've been studying the art of defending religious beliefs, commonly known as apologetics, for quite some time now, and over the years, I've noticed something fascinating. As I've watched prominent defenders navigate complex arguments, utilising philosophy, archaeology, and science, patterns began to emerge. What started as casual observations gradually crystallised into something more defined, a recipe, if you will, for becoming a successful apologist. That is, someone who can effectively keep the religious steadfast in their faith and fend off the growing doubts posed by skepticism. What really struck me is that despite appearances, it's not really about their arguments or the depth of their knowledge. There's something else, something more fundamental in how they operate, how they position themselves, and how they handle challenges to their views. So I started noting down this recipe, and what blew my mind is that every major defender of the faith, without exception, follows this exact blueprint. And what I've come to realise is that this isn't a mere coincidence. They're not merely helpful attributes that they all happen to share. No, these are prerequisites. They are required. They are the essential ingredients for success as an apologist. Whether the defender be a Presbyterian championing the ontological argument.
Part of the value of the ontological argument is to invite people to consider a more enchanting metaphysic.
An evangelical defending young earth creationism.
It is true. You can show it to be fact. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth is a fact of history.
A Muslim defending the contingency argument.
It just passes the buck to the next thing.
Or, frankly, any Christian apologist insisting the Bible doesn't endorse slavery. It's all the same.
What is happening is that the language of a legal transaction is being utilized.
Legal transaction?
It's the exact same recipe. And the flock, oh boy, they love it. They eat it up. They come for seconds.
Yummy!
So today, what I'm going to do is pull back the curtain and show you in real time how a rising apologist is cooking with this recipe. The project you're about to watch represents months of intense research, years of investment, and countless hours of dedication from the Rationality Rules team. And it wouldn't have been possible without our patrons and our channel's biggest sponsor, Ground News. Like many of you, I've watched with concern as findable, reliable, objective news has become increasingly challenging.
You are fake news.
Social media algorithms prioritize sensational headlines that generate clicks, sacrificing depth and nuance. This is precisely why Ground News has become an indispensable tool in my daily routine. It enables me, you, to analyse multiple sources covering the same story, examining their bias, credibility, and ownership patterns. In a world where it's easy to get stuck in an echo chamber, Ground News provides a way out. You can check them out at ground.news/rationality. Let me demonstrate its value with a recent example: Brazil's temporary suspension of X. Big story. Well, with Ground News, I can instantly pull over 400 articles from around the globe to see that over 60% of them are rated highly factual, a rating indicative of how subjective the reporting is likely to be. Looking closer at how different outlets cover the story, I can see how each is titling and spinning the narrative. While some sources focused on speculating about Elon Musk's response to the ban, others provided straightforward reporting on the Brazilian Supreme Court's direct order. This comprehensive feature is invaluable. It helps you maintain perspective on the full scope of any story near instantly, not just a single viewpoint. In an increasingly polarised world, this balanced approach to news consumption has never been more essential. Ground News is giving my viewers 50% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. This is the best deal of the year, and it will only be available for a limited time. Experience it for yourself at ground.news/ youtube.com/rationality. If you value balanced, reliable news coverage, I'm confident that you'll find this tool as indispensable as I have. It's thanks to Ground News that I can keep making projects like this, and so if you do sign up, you'll be helping out the channel as well. Thank you. When I first started creating content, I encountered a young Christian exploring philosophy around the same time, though he was approaching it from another side of the theological aisle. He was a Christian and I was an atheist, and it stayed that way. His name is Michael Jones, though you might know him as Inspiring Philosophy. Back then, he was just a curious mind wrestling with big questions. Today, however, he's evolved into one of the most prominent apologists on YouTube. I followed his journey with particular interest, not just because our philosophical explorations began around the same time, but because he's become a perfect case study in successful apologetics. A few months ago, I caught him on Gavin Ortland's show, and something clicked. There it was, every ingredient of the recipe I'd identified, executed with impressive precision. So today, instead of my usual approach of dissecting arguments and examining evidence, we're going to do something different. We're going to use Michael's recent appearance as our window into understanding how modern apologetics really works. Consider this your behind-the-scenes tour, with Michael as our guide to the art of becoming a decorated defender of the faith. Each apologist will, of course, trespass on the complexities of whatever topics are relevant to the argument they're defending. In this case, Michael is going to be speaking about the Conquest of Canaan, the biblical narrative describing the Israelites' invasion and occupation of Canaan as commanded by God.
Give a summary of the scholarship on this in terms of, did the conquest of Canaan actually happen? What is the overall state of scholarship on a question like that?
Well, it seems to be shifting more in the direction of historicity. It definitely seems to be moving away from the old Deaver or Finkelstein idea that this was all mythology written later. Now, that still seems to be the consensus, especially among critical scholars for sure, but the evidence overwhelmingly supports an historical conquest.
Let's pause the tape right here. Those of you familiar with the relevant fields probably just got whiplash from Michael's statement.
Well, it seems to be shifting more in the direction of historicity. Now, that still seems to be the consensus, but the evidence overwhelmingly supports an historical conquest.
The claim that scholars are shifting towards believing in the biblical historical account of the conquest of Canaan, that's about as accurate as claiming that historians are now shifting towards believing that Atlantis was a real historical civilization. It is nonsense. It's completely false. It's frankly cringe. But here's what's fascinating. The inaccuracy isn't a bug in Michael's approach. It's a feature. And to understand why, we need to look at the bigger picture. Digest the scene. We have another Christian apologist and pastor, Gavin Ortland, who's hosting a show about one of the most ethically challenging parts of the Bible, the conquest narrative. You know, the one where divine commands of slaughtering entire civilizations are issued, including children, women, and even livestock. It's the kind of material that makes modern believers squirm, that demands careful scholarly handling, the kind of topic where you would expect to see a panel of biblical scholars, archaeologists, and ethicists carefully unpacking layers of historical context and interpretation. But instead, we have Michael Jones presented as an expert voice on this complex topic. And here's what's truly revealing. If you're unaware of the scholarly consensus and watch Gavin's interview with Michael, you'd never realise that his claims are highly controversial. You'd never know that he isn't recognised as an expert in the field.
Give a summary of the scholarship on this in terms of, did the conquest of Canaan actually happen? What is the overall state of scholarship on a question like that?
The entire framework is carefully constructed to present Michael as an authoritative figure that he simply isn't. Now, don't misunderstand me here. Michael is no doubt an intelligent person, but the situation is indeed odd. It's like inviting someone who's read plenty about quantum mechanics and has come to a view vastly at odds with actual PhDs, and then introduce them as a leading physicist. Outside religions and cults, the theatrical elevation of non-experts to expert status is immediately recognised as absurd. A respectful history channel, so not the History Channel, wouldn't present a hobbyist's alternative theory about Roman history as equal to the works of classical scholars. But in religious circles, we've become so accustomed to this pattern that we barely notice it anymore. It's cultural baggage, a legacy of millennia where religious authority could simply declare expertise rather than earn it through rigorous study and peer review. But this is where we discover the first vital ingredient to becoming a successful apologist. You need a network to present you as an expert, and more importantly, you need platforms that will reinforce that image without serious question. And here's where budding apologists are lucky. These platforms are desperate for voices like Michael's. As philosophers and scientists increasingly trend towards atheism following the evidence where it leads, Christian media networks are scrambling to find articulate voices that they can elevate as authorities. And just like we're seeing here with Michael, they do this with many Christians that do not have even relevant expertise and knowledge.
Now that still seems to be the consensus, especially among critical scholars for sure.
You've seen this with creationist circles. They take someone with a philosophy degree and present them as an authority on evolution, as he assures the world that scientists are turning away from evolution in favor of God did it.
I attended a conference in 2016 at convened by the Royal Society, and it was convened by a group of evolutionary biologists who were essentially dissatisfied with neo-Darwinism, the standard textbook theory that we learn in all high school and college textbooks, and many of them were saying we need a new theory of evolution.
They take a mathematician and present him as a bastion of biology.
We've got 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. And now I quote, "The record of evolution is still surprisingly jerky, and ironically, we've even fewer examples of evolutionary transition that we had in Darwin's time."
They take someone with a doctorate of philosophy and present him as if he has a PhD and is an expert in physics.
In addition to these constants, you also find in the laws of nature certain variables that stand for arbitrary quantities that are just put in at the beginning of the universe. For example, the amount of matter versus antimatter in the early universe, or the level of entropy or thermodynamic disorder at the beginning of the universe.
Sometimes, in fact often, they present someone with a degree in ministry in apologetics, so not science at all, as an elite scientist.
Even atheists today are admitting that the universe, space-time and matter, had a beginning out of nothing.
If you're sufficiently informed, you can recognize what they're saying as utter tripe. But trust me, in fact, don't trust me. Look it up. The sophisticated Christians are doing exactly the same when it comes to the fields that you're not aware of.
Space-time and matter had a beginning out of nothing.
These Christian outlets desperately need figures they can present as experts to keep their audience satisfied, to maintain the illusion that sophisticated, intelligent defenses exist for defending all of their views. And this desperation is fantastic news for aspiring apologists.
I want to hear this from a guy like you, who clearly is, you're a smart, thinking, intelligent person. What kind of Jesus story? I heard something about a fish.
The first ingredient, a supporting network of platforms willing to present you as an expert, is readily available. They're not just willing to promote you, they're actively searching for you. The gates are wide open. You need to just walk through them and play your part. Let's move on to the second ingredient. The magic isn't just being presented as an expert, it's in becoming one in the eyes of the audience. Put it this way, if the bread of apologetics is being presented as a leading scholar, the butter is acting like one. This is where Michael has truly excelled as of late, and it's a crucial element that aspiring apologists must master. You see, it's not enough to simply be introduced as an authority, you have to inhabit that role completely, wear it like a second skin.
Michael, tell us, what is some of the newer evidence for God's existence that you're coming into?
Well, in the past couple of decades, they have found something in physics called the holographic principle.
It definitely seems to be moving away from the old Deaver or Finkelstein idea that this was all mythology.
Take Michael's performance in his interview with Gavin. Notice how his controversial claims are not simply stated. No, He delivers them with the casual confidence of someone who spent decades in the field.
But the evidence overwhelmingly supports an historical conquest.
He drops scholar names like their old colleagues.
Kenneth Kitchen, Old Testament scholar, says, duh. And Richard Hess makes this point in numerous publications, like his book Israelite Religions.
Tossing out references to archaeological findings that most viewers won't recognize. He speaks about complex historical debates as if he was summarizing last week's faculty meeting.
Jericho was a fort. You wouldn't have women and children hiding in there. They would have been out in the countryside hiding far away. The only, non-combatants would have been people running the tavern or the brothel.
Ah yes, the legendary walled city was actually just a quaint little fort with a side brothel. Apparently, when Joshua and his army came knocking, the Canaanites said, "What? Women and children? Oh, we've sent them on a lovely countryside vacation. We didn't want to protect them inside the walls, which is what the walls are for. Now come on in, why don't you? The beer's cold and the company is warm. Who needs biblical accuracy, scholarly consensus, or even common sense when you can rewrite history with such a flair? I'm sure that the authors of Joshua will be thrilled to learn that they got it all wrong. They did not devote the city to the Lord, or destroy with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep and donkey, because they had all left, apart from the ones that were in the tavern and in the brothel, of course. The fact that Michael's views dramatically differ from academic consensus is irrelevant because it doesn't come through. It's not presented. This humility, this transparency we've grown accustomed to from actual academics, it just isn't there. When, say, Dr. Joshua Bowen speaks outside of his field, he almost always makes it abundantly clear.
And again, I'm not an archaeologist. I've got a fair amount of archaeological training. I've been an archaeological excavation, but I think they're a professional archaeologist, so I want to be clear from the outset about that.
But with apologists, the hosts nor the guests ever make this clear, and that is deliberate.
What is the overall state of scholarship on a question like that?
But the evidence overwhelmingly supports an historical conquest.
Even the mere possibility that Michael might be speaking beyond his expertise, it's beside the point. It's not there. And there's a good reason for this. That would be a mistake. That's not how apologetics works. That's not what the audience is tuning in for. What matters is the performance of authority, and Michael, he has mastered this. These two ingredients, being presented as an expert and acting as an expert, are the foundations of apologetics. Without them, the whole apologetic souffle collapses. You can have all the philosophical arguments in the world, you can memorize every archaeological finding from Jerusalem to Jericho, but without a network willing to present you as an authority and the ability to perform that authority convincingly, you're just another voice in the wilderness. And here's the thing. Once you understand these two ingredients, once you notice them, you start seeing them everywhere. Because they are everywhere. Every successful apologist, from William Lane Craig to Ravi Zacharias, from Frank Turek to Michael Jones, has mastered this recipe.
Space-time and matter had a beginning out of nothing.
It's like spotting product placement in films. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. But what happens when someone comes along and points out the Emperor's new clothes are, well, notably absent? What happens when actual scholars, genuine experts, or even just informed skeptics challenge these self-proclaimed authorities? That's where the other ingredients come into play, these secret spices, if you will, that turn a simple performance into a full-blown apologetic feast. And what are those ingredients? Well, they're a story for another time. In our next episode, we're going to dive into the defensive techniques, the rhetorical flourishes, and the clever maneuvers that apologists employ when their expertise is questioned. Trust me, it's going to be delicious. I'm Stephen Woodford. Thanks for watching, and an extra special thank you to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon, YouTube membership, however it might be. And indeed, a big thank you to Ground News. If you want 50% off their Vantage plan, then please do visit the link below. Ground News is a fantastic way to make sense of an increasingly convoluted world. Thanks.